Andy, for doing this for the BEAC. We appreciate your time. I guess I'll start off by just asking you to tell us a little bit about your media experience and then your educational background as well.
So I started in media in 1982, and my last job in media was in probably the summer of 98. So that was a 16-year career, and I did mostly journalism. I started out like everybody else, doing a little bit of reporting, a little bit of anchoring. I worked both in radio and television. And then about halfway through my media career, so about 7 or 8 years in, I got hired as a news director. So I was a news director probably for as much time as I was anything else. Meanwhile, in about 1993 or so, I had started teaching and taught part-time until 98 when I got a job in Dubai. And I worked in Dubai for 2 years. And then in 2000, I got hired at Camosun College. Educationally, before I even got into media, I had managed to get a BA. I got a BA in 1979, of all things. And then I guess I was a little bit early having this opinion, but I realized, of course, that I wasn't going to get any jobs with a BA in English. So I went to Fanshawe and did their broadcast journalism program. So I did that for 2 years. And then I went to the BANF Center for one of their intensive 3-month workshops. Did a little bit more education in the 90s with learning some stuff about digital media. But really, my master's was my first kind of academic educational experience in well over 30 years, really.
And why did you decide then to go back to school, basically, right? Back to school. It's what we've done as adults. Why did you decide to do that?
Well, there was a very practical reason for me going back to school. I mean, the rules of the game had changed at Camosun. The program that I had taught in was being closed down, and they wanted to reinvigorate. They wanted to start a new program, but one of the mandates for that new program was that we were to be able to get as many transfer credits as possible, meaning that students who were taking courses in this new program needed to, or would be able to take their credits and move them on to, say, Vancouver Island University or UVic or Royal Roads, for that matter. And in order to do that, the mandate was that teachers had to have a master's. And I think, like a lot of my colleagues, we're facing the situation where colleges are demanding masters from their students or from their teachers now. So, and I was really lucky that Royal Roads was in Victoria because, first of all, Royal Roads is one of the few places that offers a master's in communications that you can do online. But also I knew a lot of the instructors and I knew a lot of the people. And then the third thing that was really fortunate about it was Camosun and Royal Roads, our two communications departments for years have been trying to establish some kind of formal educational relationship. So I just thought this was a good opportunity to kind of know some of the people and get to know the inner workings of that school. So in many ways, it just came together. It was a really good choice for me.
And what was the process like to apply after so many years of not being in school and then having to go through this process? What did you need?
I think I had to write a short essay, so I would say 2 or 3 pages. I had to fill out, of course, an application form. And then probably the most onerous task of it was to get all the transcripts, to get a transcript for my BA, which was from Trent University in 79, and then from Fanshawe, and then from the Banff Center. And then I had to get one from Canada College as well. That was the place I'd done some education in the 90s. They tell you every one of your post-secondary transcripts you have to provide, right? You have to provide proof that you've got the certificate or the credential that you were going for. And that turned out to be a real hassle. I'll tell you that, one of the ones, I won't tell you which one, but I just happened to call. It was one of those, it's one of those journalistic things, right? You send a couple of emails and it doesn't work out. So you start making phone calls and you just start making random phone calls. And I made it a random phone call and talked to the guy who was the assistant to the registrar who was going to be doing all of this stuff. And that person had just been laid off. So this person that I was talking to ended up actually sort of going out of his way and providing the transcript and information for me. And if that hadn't happened, I don't know what would have happened. I don't know if I'd have gotten all my transcripts or not.
So it was a long process. Did you ever feel like giving up as you were
No,
trying to do this? No? Okay.
No, it was just, well, you know what it's like. You've been a reporter, Anna. You know what it's like. That's just like a challenge, right? That's like a red flag in front of a bull. Oh, you're not going to answer. Well, I'm gonna find out and make this work. So yeah, no, it wasn't a, it was a hassle and it's time consuming, and you got to do it. It's a part of the process, but I think you just got to have the right attitude when you go for it.
So once you found out that you had actually been accepted, how did you feel? What was the feeling?
Um, Boy, I felt pretty overwhelmed. I mean, at the time, I had that twin concern, and I think everybody who, goes on and decides to do this, the twin concern of making sure I've got enough income coming in to keep the household running, trying to manage the closure of this program, which is kind of unique to my situation, but also going back to school at the same time was, I think, all in all, a pretty overwhelming situation. So, I didn't really have time to sit back and think about it on a regular basis, which was a good thing. I just kind of got after it and did it. Once I got accepted, it was like, all right, well, here we go. I'm signing away basically 2 years of my life and an awful lot of money to get a credential.
Now, you were doing it full time at the beginning and then part time.
Yeah, yeah.
Were you in the classroom as well, or was it all online?
Well, the way the Royal Roads system works is that it's you have to do two residencies over the 2 year period, and each residency is about a 3 week long period. So most of the time you're working online, but you do have those really, really critical residency times. So you have to get time off for that. And in my first year, for the first residency, I basically took holidays. And made arrangements at work so that so they wouldn't be short. And then the second one, the way it worked out, by the time the second year came around, I was back to half time. I wasn't working full time, and so because Royal Roads and Camosun are in the same city, I managed to organize it so that I missed a couple of things for the residency, but mostly I worked and did the residency at the same time.
Wow. So looking back, what kind of advice would you be able to give to people who are thinking about going through this process?
I would generally be positive. I would say, first of all, especially if you've done journalism, you'll find that doing higher academic work is an extension of journalism. You have to be able to write well. You have to be able to research and find information really well. The writing style is somewhat different. The research demands are a little bit higher, but it's basically the same process. So that would be my first reflection, is that, it's not that much different from what many people have done already. But the other things you have to realize is that it takes an inordinate amount of time. So my first year where I was working full time, I don't think I'd do that again. I would, highly recommend if somebody is get some kind of consideration from where you're working and get cut back to 3/4 time. If you can afford it, even cut back to half time, because, at certain times the demands are really heavy. So, and in my worst weeks, I would tell you that, I probably worked a couple hours every evening after school, Monday to Friday. And then I would work, a good. So my worst weeks, I probably worked a solid 10-hour day on Saturday and maybe an 8-hour day on Sunday. I had Sunday evening off. That seemed like real luxury at the time. So you are kind of signing your life away in a way. There's a lot of time, and you have to make it a priority. There's no going to Hawaii for 2 weeks, while this is going on, because you just don't have the time. There's just too much to be done.
Now, you had to do a major research project as part of this. And how did you decide what you were going to do? How long did that part of it take? And just tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, coincidentally, at the time that I'd started my master's, I found out some really interesting information about my family, about my great-grandfather, who played a key role in the residential school issue. In 1907, he'd been the chief medical officer and was the first person to document health abuses at residential schools and to recommend changes. So this came along at the same time that I was starting my master's. And of course, I don't know why, I just decided there was a big connection between those two. So I had to tie those two together. And that took a little bit of that took a lot of finagling. Actually, that was the tough thing because it's a communications degree, right? You got to sort of focus on communications. And what I had done really early on was I thought, I wonder what the news coverage was. In 1907, my great grandfather had created this report, written a report, and then it had been leaked to the press. And so this just really intrigued me. So just out of my own personal curiosity, I checked out the article, the leak article, and kind of read that, and then eventually, and I mean, this took a long time. I mean, I started my process for the master or for the thesis, in full swing probably in January. And about midway through February, I just submitted my proposal, and my committee came back, and they just kind of shook their heads and said, man, I don't know where you're going, but you got to find a way to kind of bring all these things together. So, and that's one part about the thesis. You got to remember. Well, anyways, we'll get that in a minute. But anyways, I realized that the media exposure that report got was a really good cornerstone to start looking at how the media looks at Indigenous issues in general. And so what I decided to do was do a narrative analysis of the story and the reaction stories. How much coverage did this story actually get across the country? How many times was it reprinted? What were the follow-up stories? All that kind of thing. And then I wanted to take that experience and transplant it into the modern day situation. And so that's how my thesis came out. I ended up doing a thesis on how on how media narratives have to change in order to bring the Indigenous and the Indigenous community and the rest of Canada together.
And you found some very interesting things as part of that thesis. Your research kind of showed that a lot of more work needs to be done in that area, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of things that were seen in the coverage of the report in 1907 continue to this day. The key thing being that the two key things that I discovered was that in the 1907 reporting of my great grandfather's report, the dominant feature of it was the politics involved with residential schools, rather than the impact on the victims, on the children who are actually at residential schools. And then the other thing I found out was that the story didn't generate a hell of a lot of interest. It was broken in a couple of papers. It was reprinted in less than half a dozen other papers in Canada over the next couple of weeks. And there were no follow-up or reaction stories to it. So the other conclusion I drew, which I think is still true or has been true, is that editorial decision makers don't necessarily think that Indigenous issues are that important.
So how long then was just the research project on its own, or the thesis? How many months did you work on that?
So I started in January, and I had to have the rough draft ready for my thesis supervisor by June. So, and I hit that deadline very easily. And then at that point, the way the Royal Road system works is, and I mean, I had worked a lot with my thesis supervisor, right? We had a really good back and forth relationship. And as I was rewriting it and putting it together, I was sending her chunks and bits and pieces, and she was critiquing the bits and pieces. So by the time my rough draft was done, which was June, I basically had very few changes to make. I submitted it to committee. I got, some feedback on some changes, made those changes, and I was done by mid to end of July.
And would you say that part of your degree was the hardest part, or just an idea of how you felt about it?
Well, I'll tell you that the hardest part of the whole master's process was the first term. And I'm not sure if they all do that, but I think the first term is such a culture shock for you. You're going back to school, you're learning how to rewrite, you're learning how to write differently, you're learning how to research in a better fashion. So, you're learning a lot of skills. So right off the bat, that first term was the hardest. And once I got past that, that was fine. I really wanted to do a thesis. I really decided that if I was going to do a master's, I wanted to do a thesis. I wanted to create my own stuff. I just didn't want to do some kind of research project. I wanted to write and create a body of work on its own. So, for me, I mean, the thesis was you're at the end of a very long process, so you're exhausted. So it's really hard to have good vibe about that. But on the other hand, the thesis is what it was all about for me. Yeah.
And did you have any regrets when you first started? You were in the process of getting the degree. Did you feel like, oh, I shouldn't have done this? And if you did, how did you overcome those sort of feelings to get through it?
Um, I do remember feeling around about the end of that first term. So what happens is you get your first projects back, and generally, if you're an A student, you're generally getting B's on your first stuff, right? So that's pretty discouraging. And I remember, after working all evening on something, and not getting a lot of sleep, I remember sitting across the breakfast table from my wife and saying, I don't know if I can do this. I just don't know if I've got the energy and the fortitude to pull this off. So that was kind of like the lowest point, I think. After that, I started to get some work back. My second round of projects that I'd done for people, all of a sudden, I went from getting B's to A minuses and A's. Like I picked up stuff really quickly without really realizing it, and it became a lot easier after that. So I think that was my only kind of regret moment, was really in that first term, especially after getting that first round of projects back. But on the other hand, I'd always wanted to do a master's. I knew lots of people who had masters. I knew I could do it. I just wasn't sure that the circumstance was right.
And what are your plans for the future in terms of your education? Do you plan on doing a PhD? Are you thinking about it?
I think if I was going to do a PhD, I'd really have to be committed to a topic, which I think you probably understand what I mean. A PhD means that you're going to research one topic for an awful long period of time and in an awful lot of depth. And I just haven't found that project that's going to do that for me. I've got other things that are going on, and I'm not particularly interested in getting a doctorate. The other thing is an age thing, right? I'm in my late 50s. By the time I get a doctorate, I'm going to be in my early 60s. What am I going to do with it? It just, from a practical point of view, it just doesn't fit my plans.
So, what advice would you give to people who are thinking about getting a graduate degree after, they're teaching right now at a college or university, and they're thinking about doing this? What advice would you give to them?
I think right off the bat, I'd see what kind of consideration is available for you from your school. So see if there is some kind of way that you can get a little bit of an LOA so that you have some time to actually work on this. Working full time and doing a degree at the same time I just don't think it's on, especially if you've got other people in your life, if you've got another life. So that's the first thing I think you have to do. I think you might want to I think for some people it's not a choice. I think there are some colleges that are just saying, you got to do this. You got to have a master's. So the other thing is to make sure you've got the money in place to do it, because they're not cheap. I'm pretty sure the Royal Roads Masters now is over $20,000. So, you really got to put that into consideration. Are you going to have the money set aside to do this? And you got to have the agreement of your family. My wife was great. She knew that it was going to be, a really tough road and a long haul. And so she was really willing to help out and take over some of those household chores that I would normally do, and put up with the fact that I was basically living in my office for 2 years.
Well, thank you very much for agreeing to do this interview. The information that you've provided, I think, will help a lot of people as they think about whether or not they should take that step. It is a big step, and that's why we were hoping to speak to people that have gone through that process to give advice to those who are thinking about it, or may even be in the process of doing it and are, starting to feel a little bit tired. Or so it's great advice. Thanks very much for that.
My pleasure. Thank you.